This is David Harvey, and you're listening to the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a podcast that looks at capitalism through a Marxist lens. This podcast is made possible by Democracy at Work. In the last podcast, I featured a story in which there is a terrible choice, in a way, between doing what is right and doing what is possible. And in some cases, not only is it possible, but it's absolutely essential that the wrong thing be done because that is the only option open. So I want to capitalize on that idea for a moment and go back to one of the podcasts I did a long time ago, which got me into quite a bit of trouble. And in that podcast, what I did was to say, listen, I think that capital is too big to fail. And I didn't argue it very well, and I tried to clear some of it thinking up afterwards. But I'm going to go back to it because I think this is a terribly important question that needs to be laid out as calmly as we possibly can. And the question really has to do with the prospects for real revolutionary transformation in our times and what might be meant by revolutionary transformation given the kind of situation which we now have. In my original argument, what I wanted to say was that the capitalist system has become so widespread, so integrated, so put together that the kind of question of socialism can't be reduced any longer to the laborers appropriating the property of the capitalists and associated labor kind of becoming dominant in the organization of a firm. It can't be that anymore, because capital is so systemic that really the path to socialism can only be defined by what might be called a kind of redesign of the whole system, rather than simply, laborers taking over the means of production and becoming the managers. That's not adequate anymore. So what I wanted to say was, when we start to think about this system redesign, we're confronting something which is very, very, very large. Now, Marx himself actually set up this problem, but he never actually drew the lessons from it. And I want to go back to that. In the Grundrisse, what Marx kind of says is, look, we've been considering matters from the standpoint of the individual capitalist right to this moment. So when we're talking about productive labor and productive activity, we're talking about an individual capitalist firm or even an individual capitalist person. But at a certain point, all of this gets socialized, and we start to find ourselves behaving in such a way which is not how we would behave if we were left to ourselves, but is a way that we are forced to behave by what Marx calls the coercive laws of competition. The coercive laws of competition force capital, for example, to certain kinds of technological change. These technological changes are such as to give certain advantage to individual capitalists who adopt them first. So we get something Marx called relative surplus value through technological advantage. But the problem is that the technological advantage comes by removing labor from production. Now, if labor is the source of all value, that means there's less value to go around. Therefore, technological change and the relative surplus value is at the source of the falling rate of profit. And therefore, there is less profit to go around socially. So that, in a sense, individual capitalists operating in their own self-interest produce a systemic result which is antagonistic to the well-being and the capacities of the capitalist class as a whole. So no capitalist would actually engage in technological innovation if they knowingly thought that technological innovation was going to lower their rate of profit. I mean, it would be an insane thing to do. But they do it because they don't know that it's going to lower the rate of profit, and therefore and it's the coercive laws of competition that force them to do it. So what Marx then says is, by the time we've got through all of this, what we're looking at now is a system, and the whole system is integrated, and the integrations within the system are such that we find ourselves responding to abstractions. And he has a very interesting kind of moment that when he kind of says, and it's these abstractions and the contradictions implicit in these abstractions which start to actually dominate how a capitalist system works, independent of what the opinions and ideas of the individual capitalists are, and therefore independent of whoever is in charge of the firm. So what happens then is that if the laborers somehow or other, as associated laborers, take over the ownership and management of the firm and set up a cooperative enterprise and say, well, okay, the social relations are very different and all this kind of thing. If those social relations are embedded systemically in a system that's organized through the coercive laws of competition, then in a way it doesn't matter whether it is the capitalists who own the firm or whether it's the laborers and the associated laborers, because they're both going to operate in exactly the same way because the coercive laws of competition are going to force them to do this. Now, this is a sort of problem that is confronted say, in Argentina, where there's been a lot of takeovers of firms and cooperatives set up, and all of them, to some degree, do a good job or try to do a good job of improving the social relations within the company, within the firm. But the firm is in competition with other firms, and through competition finds itself forced to certain labor practices and certain forms of efficiency and so on, so that the large number of recuperated enterprises that exist in Argentina, in a way, end up being enterprises which are self-managed, but they're still capitalistic because they're embedded within the system. So this is the point at which you would say, look, it's the whole system that has to be addressed, not the individual enterprise, and that therefore the notion of socialism, which we have to pursue, is about the redesign of the whole system rather than about the individual elements within the system setting up as cooperatives or setting up as worker-controlled collectives or whatever. So this is, if you like, the dilemma which we are now confronted with. And what I really meant to say in that piece where I was saying capital is too big to fail is that when you look at the whole system, the question of how to manage that whole system and how to escape from the coercive laws of competition and how to escape from the systemic forces which are orchestrated within that system becomes a really, really different story. And I was thinking about this in particular in the following kind of way. One of the largest enterprises in the world right now is Apple. And Apple is, I think, capitalized at over $3 billion these days. And Apple, of course, produces computers, and one of the big sources of computers is and phones and that, and all of the technology we need for social media and digitalization and so on. All of that is mediated by this one firm, Apple, which is very, very dominant in this area, along with others, Samsung and some of the Chinese. And then you sort of say, well, okay, what would happen if the workers took over Apple? Would Apple be able to behave differently than it currently does? Will we need computers and iPhones and all of those things and digital systems in a socialist world? If we want to have computers, then some organization like Apple has to be organized and the fact that it's a quasi-monopoly or oligopoly is in itself saying that Apple has a certain kind of monopoly social power, which is inherent in Apple. And then the question is, well, how would workers, if they took over Apple, use that power, and what would that power be about? Now, it turns out that Apple, of course, uses computer chips. And then you say, well, who makes the computer chips? Well, there are basically three major companies: Intel, which is US; Samsung, which is South Korean; and TCMS, which is Taiwan microchip company. Those three companies basically pretty much monopolize the microchip market. So where does most of those microchips go? Well, they go to Apple, or they go to the other computer companies, and this is just the start of the story. So then you say, well, where do the microchips get their parts from? The silicon and all the rest of it. And so you suddenly find yourself looking at an integrated system of production. And we would want, in a socialist society, to have computers. I submit, want to have our phones and all the digital things that are becoming possible. And we will want to have electric automobiles and so on, which use these kinds of computer chips and so on. So we would need all of this. And that is huge, because I've mentioned the capitalization of Apple is $3 trillion, over $3 trillion. The capitalization of Intel, I don't know what it is, but it's huge. Samsung employs around, I don't know, 300,000 people around the world in various kinds, and has a capitalization of. I mean, you're dealing with something which is so massive, and then you kind of say, well, a socialist society wants those products, and as soon as you say wants those products, you're then into actually having to specify exactly what kind of organization can create and produce those products in a reasonably efficient and, dare I say it, a reasonably cheap way. And if there is an issue there, then at a certain point, what we will find ourselves doing is saying, all right, let's suppose the socialist revolution comes, and we are the collective commissars of the socialist revolution. What are we going to do about the production of computers, and how will it be organized, and who will organize it, and who will lay it out? And in a funny kind of way, there are some people now who are beginning to argue that the level of concentration and centralization of capital is almost to the point of it being socialized. And it is interesting that what Marx did in his language, when he started to say, well, we're no longer concerned with the individual capitalist, we are interested in the socialized system. And he uses the word, it's the social rather than the individual. And when we move to the social, the whole definition of what is productive and unproductive changes, because one part may seem unproductive until it is integrated with another part. And what I wanted to say was, in Marx's time, organizations of this size and this breadth did not exist. And the whole question of how to integrate them and how to utilize them. So are we going to say, all right, the kind of organization that currently exists is in fact the prototype of what a socialist form of organization would look like? In which case the production system is not going to be radically changed, because the production system is as efficient as it possibly can be. Let us make that assumption that Intel and TCMS and Samsung are pretty efficient firms. Can we imagine that somehow or other those firms would become more efficient under socialist management than they currently are? And my answer to that is I doubt that's the case. Maybe it could happen, but I don't subscribe to the idea that somehow or other the productive forces are held back by the social relations. In this case, the productive forces seem to be pretty much at optimal level. And if we mess around with the social relations, maybe that will interfere a bit with the productive forces. So it's the other way. Could well be the other way around. The evidence of state management of complex systems is not that good. I'm not saying that it's impossible, because in some cases, the French cases, for example, the state management has turned out to be far superior to corporate management. But in other cases, a lot of the time, when you're looking at systemically, it doesn't matter whether you're looking at state management or private corporations with shareholders and all the rest of it. What does matter, however, is the distribution of the well-being. And this brings me back to kind of saying, well, okay, there was another choice to take. And I mentioned this argument that the labor theory of value, as it was held by the Ricardians and taken up by Marx, suggested that all value originated with living labor being applied in production. And if that was the case, then the Ricardians started to ask the question, if labor is the source of all value, then how come the laborers get so little of it? And this led into, in the 1820s and 1830s and 1840s, into a very strong kind of current of opinion of Ricardian socialism, culminating in John Stuart Mill kind of saying, well, we should actually redistribute the wealth that comes from everything. And therefore we get this notion of Ricardian redistributive socialism, which underpinned what social democracy was about in Europe, underpinned very much the kind of notions that Scandinavian socialism was about, and which is the kind of political positionality taken by Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and Piketty and all the rest of it. In other words, you would say, look, the system as it's devised by Apple plus Intel plus say Walmart, those systems are actually adequate to socialism. And all we have to do, however, is to redistribute the wealth adequately. So instead of a few people getting all of the surplus value, we start to really radically redistribute it. So now Marx was intensely critical of John Stuart Mill's theory of socialism, which was about redistribution and saying you can't touch production. I mean, that's the way John Stuart Mill put it. But what I wanted to ask, in effect, with this notion that capitalism is too big to fail, is, are these production systems, like those in Apple, like those in Intel, like those in Samsung, and distributive systems like those in Walmart and so on, are these, in effect, so efficient and so systemic in their relationship to each other that they mutually support all of each other in a coherent, systemic way, that we could not actually then accept that would be the prototype of what a socialist economy might look like. And then the big question would become the question of redistribution of wealth. Now, that puts me back into the John Stuart Mill camp. And I say, okay, Marx was very, very critical of John Stuart Mill and his theory of redistributive socialism. And I think there's a question there. But I realistically ask everybody who's listening to this to seriously think about the question of, how are we going to take these incredibly complex production systems, producing incredibly complex chips and capacities, underpinning major productive capacity and abilities for artificial intelligence and all the rest of it, all of those things, are we going to accept that those are going to be at the core of what socialism is about? And if it is at the core, how is it going to be changed under socialist management? And how will those changes under socialist management preserve the current effectiveness and the current efficiency and the current mobilization of productive forces as they are embedded in current systems? How are they going to be changed in a socialist project? In other words, the socialist project, as it was conceived in Marx's time, did not have to address that question. And Marx talked about the socialization of the production process and all of its implications, but it basically kind of left it to one side when it came to the question of thinking about the socialist alternative. We now have to think about a socialist alternative that will address those questions. Otherwise, we could take the position of the primitivists and say, okay, we want to do without computers. We're going to crash all computers, throw them all into something. We're going to actually radically change the productive apparatus and change the standard of living in radically different ways. I am personally not in favor of that, and I am against that. What I would really want to do, if I could find a way to do it, was to think about how to socialize what is already partially socialized through these structures like Apple with the computer chip companies and with the Foxconn and all the rest of it, and Walmart and all the rest of it. How can we socialize all of that in a way that makes it much more acceptable as a labor process and makes it much more acceptable in terms of the remuneration of those participating in those labor processes? How can we envisage that at the social level, as opposed to maintaining a kind of vision of socialism that is simply about the laborers dispossessing and the boss and taking over the management of their own production apparatus. That kind of approach to socialism simply will not and does not work. The problem, of course, with redistributive socialism is it didn't work either. In the way it was set out, so that, for example, Sweden has some redistributive socialism, and many aspects of that were rather good, but in the long run, the monopoly of the control over the means of production and the large corporate forms in Scandinavia and so on have become a problem, as they become a problem here, because the individual wealth in society is now the wealth which is drawn from the kind of the monopoly powers of Amazon or Apple or Intel or wherever. So those are the issues, and I want to lay them out there. Not that I have answers to it, but to recognize that a simple gut reaction to sort of me saying, "Oh well, this is too big a system to be sort of easily transformed into something which is socialist." I didn't appreciate that gut reaction, but I want to put the question out there so that we can freely think about it, and at least then come up with some idea as to what would a socialist movement try to do. Would it be simply about redistribution, or would it be further about the reorganization of production and in radically different ways? Those are the questions which I would want to put upon the agenda. Thank you for joining me today. You've been listening to David Harvey's Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a Democracy at Work production. A special thank you to the wonderful Patreon community for supporting this project.